Hi everyone, this is part 2 of the respiratory system lecture. There are a total of 3 parts and this is part 2 of 3. So in this lecture video, we are going to start talking about lung physiology and talk about some laws of physics and chemistry that govern how air moves from the atmosphere into the lungs, how oxygen diffuses from air into the bloodstream and circulates all through the body, and tissues get oxygen and they go into Krebs cycle to generate ATP. One of the byproducts of Krebs cycle is carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide travels through your bloodstream and is brought back to the heart. From there, it gets pumped into the lungs, which is where carbon dioxide goes from liquid phase off into gas phase, and we exhale it out. So I really like this diagram because it's showing you a visual of what is happening in the various phases of this entire process. So I'm going to start here at point number 1. The first major step in this process is called pulmonary ventilation. Now, pulmonary ventilation is happening in your lungs. So I'm going to write here that it's happening in your lungs. So in the first stage, and please note that this process, I'm explaining it in chronological order, but this stuff is happening concurrently, right? So this is the first of 4 major steps in the process of respiration as a whole. And the first step, which is pulmonary ventilation, is happening in the lungs. So as you inhale, your thoracic cavity expands and air, which contains O2, which is oxygen gas. Air contains a mixture of gases, and O2, or oxygen, is just one of them. So oxygen enters from Earth's atmosphere into lungs in the first step. Now it's reaching your alveoli, right? So when we inhale, air enters all the way through our bronchial tree, which I explained in the last video. It goes through the bronchial tree, including the bronchioles, and it's going to enter your alveolar sac. Now, from there, oxygen gas specifically. We're not talking about any other gases like nitrogen, hydrogen, methane, or anything else, right? We're talking about oxygen gas specifically is going to diffuse from gas phase. It's going to become liquid, or it's going to enter. I shouldn't say it becomes liquid. I should say that oxygen moves into blood, and blood is a liquid. So in the second stage is where pulmonary gas exchange is happening. So oxygen gas is entering your bloodstream. And please note, as I talked about in the last video, that the red tube here is going to end up becoming the pulmonary vein. The blue tube is the pulmonary artery, right? So oxygen is entering, eventually it is entering the pulmonary vein. And from here, it is going to the heart. Now let's say here is where the heart is. So from the heart, blood containing oxygen gas is pumped all through the body, right? So it goes everywhere in your body, to your skin, to your brain, to every tissue in the body. Now, here in the last step, you're at individual tissues. So you're maybe in the bone marrow, you're in the skin, you're at muscles, any tissue in the body that you think of. This is happening. So when oxygenated blood reaches so here from the pulmonary gas exchange, oxygen is going to move into the pulmonary vein, and the pulmonary vein carries it to the heart. Now from here on, from the heart outward, this red tube are your arteries. That's your arterial system. So your arteries exiting the heart are going to take this freshly oxygenated blood to all your tissues, which is where oxygen gets unloaded. It hops off the ride and enters your tissue cells. So one way to put this is in your lung, oxygen gets loaded onto blood. It hops on the ride. And when you reach systemic tissues, oxygen gets unloaded or hops off. When oxygen gets unloaded, it enters the tissues, which are undergoing cellular respiration. So while glycolysis doesn't need oxygen, Krebs cycle does. So Krebs cycle is using that oxygen to generate ATP, Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. And as a result of that, tissues that are undergoing cellular respiration are synthesizing carbon dioxide. So now we are taking carbon dioxide. Now carbon dioxide is going to get loaded onto blood here in the tissues. It hops on the ride, and it goes all through the veins of your body until it gets to the heart. So right here where it says gas transport, we're going to write a heart. Now from the heart, it gets into the pulmonary artery, which is where it goes to the lung, right here, into the alveolus. Now in the alveolus is where carbon dioxide gets unloaded. We exhale and carbon dioxide is exhaled back into the Earth's atmosphere. So my suggestion when you're going over this is to draw out, right? Draw out the outside the atmosphere, chart what's happening to oxygen, draw heart, what's happening between atmosphere and the heart with the alveoli. Then what's happening from the heart to the systemic tissues with oxygen. Then what's happening with the carbon dioxide at the tissues, followed by carbon dioxide to the heart, and then carbon dioxide back to the lung and off into the atmosphere. So here, the pulmonary ventilation that I talked about on the previous slide is breathing. So breathing is essentially inhaling or inspiration and exhaling or expiration. Now we're continuously breathing. Holding your breath becomes very uncomfortable after a minute or two, and that breathing that is happening in the background involuntarily, it's part of your autonomic respiratory system, is quiet breathing or eunia. Now, forced breathing is what happens is when somebody either mindfully tells you to take a deep breath in and a deep breath out, or the vigorous breathing that happens after exercising. So doing cardio for 10 or 15 minutes makes you breathe vigorously. That is forced breathing. Now, those respiratory nuclei in your brain exist in the medulla oblongata and the pons that we briefly touched on in Unit 4 of A&P 1. So basically what's happening is that to inhale, your external intercostals are pulling your ribs outward, your diaphragm contracts, and upon inhalation, the thoracic cavity volume increases, or lung volume increases. The opposite happens during exhalation. So during exhalation, your internal intercostals are pulling your ribs inward, your diaphragm relaxes, and your thoracic volume and your lung volume is decreasing. Now here is a foundational principle, right? Air moves down its pressure gradient. So essentially what we're saying here is that air is going to move from a high pressure area to a low pressure area. So air is always going to move from where it is pressurized to where there is low pressure. I want to apologize if you heard my dogs barking in the previous slide. I swear I recorded that slide 5 times and those little stinkers had decided to just somehow continue to bark. So this particular slide, we are talking about all of the skeletal muscles that we use in order to breathe. So most of these muscles were covered in your muscular system, so I'm not going to talk about them. But the most important ones here, especially for quiet breathing, are your diaphragm and your external intercostals. So when your external intercostals contract, your ribs are pulled outwards and upwards. When your diaphragm contracts, it gets flatter, so the chest volume here increases. The opposite happens when you exhale. So when you exhale, your internal intercostals are pulling your ribs back downwards and inwards, and your diaphragm relaxes and becomes into its relaxed dome position. So in addition to those major muscles, we're also using our SCM and our scalenes, especially when we're taking those mindful deep breaths in. In the back, we're using parts of our erector spinae, the pec minor here, especially for ribs 2, 3, 4, and 5. As well as some abdominal muscles for deep belly breathing. Now, the next important concept is thoracic cavity volume, right? So we'll deal with inhalation or inspiration first, and we'll deal with exhalation and expiration second. So there are some gas laws that we are going to be talking about, and in this particular slide, I'm going to talk about one of them. The other two I'm going to talk about in the next particular lecture video. So as we inhale, so our thoracic cavity at rest has a certain volume. So when you inhale, the diaphragm contracts and it becomes flatter, so it moves downwards. In addition to that, your ribs are pulled outwards and upwards. So these three things, the diaphragm being pulled downwards, your ribs being pulled outwards, and your ribs being pulled upwards towards out from the sternum, cause the thoracic cavity to have increased volume during inspiration. The opposite is going to happen during expiration. So thoracic volume decreases during expiration. So the opposite is going to happen. So the diaphragm relaxing moves upwards. So a relaxed diaphragm has a dome-like shape. In addition to that, your ribs are pulled inwards by your internal intercostals, and your ribs are pulled back inferiorly into their normal or at rest position. Now the gas law that we're going to talk about. So in the 2 slides ago, we talked about how gas moves from a high pressure area, or where it is pressurized, to a low pressure area until equilibrium is achieved. Right? So gas moves from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure until equilibrium. And Boyles Law, in lay terms, says that if you have gas in a container of a certain volume, if you increase the volume of the container, you decrease the pressure. So if the volume container increases, the pressure of the gas inside it decreases. So basically here, according to Boyles Law, the container volume and gas pressure have an inversely proportional relationship. If the volume increases, the pressure decreases. And this has a disclaimer, right? So we're assuming here that the temperature stays constant. So the fancy terminology for Boyle's Law is that the pressure inside a container, the gas pressure inside a container decreases if you increase the volume of a container. So here's a piston inside a glass container, and these red dots represent gas molecules. So for some reason, if you pull out the piston, the volume of this container increases. So per Boyle's Law, when the volume of the container increases, the gas inside becomes less pressurized, or the gas pressure decreases. The opposite is true as well. So if you're moving this piston down, you are decreasing the volume of the container. When you're decreasing the volume of the container, the gas inside becomes more pressurized. So you decrease the volume of a container, the gas pressure inside it increases. So here is an equation, right? So P1 and V1 represent your initial conditions. So your initial conditions at rest. So P1 is at rest pressure, P2 is at rest volume. Now say you inhaled. When you inhaled, your volume changes. Your lung volume increases. When lung volume increases, the pressure inside the lung decreases. So here, if you want to find out, so P1 V1 equals P2 V2. If you want to find out what the P2 variable is, you can bring it to the other side, and if you want to find out V2, essentially, you can do P1 multiplied by V1 divided by P2. So that basically says that there is an inverse relationship between two variables. Those two variables being gas pressure and container volume, right? So if one goes up, the other goes down. Now, in the human system, the container here is your lung. So imagine this. If your container is the lung, when you inhale, the volume of the container increases. So there is less pressure inside your lung compared to the atmosphere. So if gas is more pressurized in the atmosphere compared to your lung, from where to where would the gas move, right? Gas moves from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So during inspiration, it's high in the atmosphere, it is low in your lung because your lung volume increased. So air, which is gas, is going to move from the atmosphere into the container, which is lung. The opposite is going to happen at expiration. Now let's talk about pressure gradients. So imagine there are two sort of connected areas of a container, right? This is area A and this is area B. Now imagine that there are equal gas molecules. So these red dots are representations of gas molecules. So say you had X gas molecules in area A and equal X in area B. So if you have two interconnected containers, both with equal gas pressure, there would be no, because it's at equilibrium, right? So there would be no net movement from area A to area B because there was equilibrium. Now imagine if you had area A and you suddenly increased the volume of area B. You made the container bigger, or you had inspiration, you inhaled. Now, because the container volume increased, per Boyles Law, the container pressure decreased. Gas moves from an area of high concentration, which is in area A here, to an area of low pressure, right? Not concentration, pressure. So it moves from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure until equilibrium. So because the volume increased, gas is going to move from area A to area B because the pressure gradient just changed when you changed the volume. Now let's do the opposite. Let's exhale or decrease the volume of area B. When you decrease the volume of area B, per Boyles Law, the pressure of the gas inside it increased. Gas moves from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So here, gas is going to move from area B to area A because you decreased the volume of area B. So that essentially explains what Boyles Law is. Now let's add some numbers here. So atmospheric pressure, so atmospheric air is a mixture of several gases, right? We have hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, we have some inert gases like helium, that kind of stuff. So the pressure of combined atmospheric air is 760 millimeters of mercury. The Hg here stands for mercury. So when you exhale, I'm going to talk about exhalation first, and I'll leave you to draw a flow chart like this for inspiration. So imagine that this person just exhaled. So the thoracic cavity volume decreased, right? So the thoracic volume decreasing will cause air to become at a higher pressure inside the lungs and a lower pressure in the atmosphere. So that will make gas, or in this case carbon dioxide, move from an area of high pressure, which is inside his lung, to an area of low pressure, which is outside in the atmosphere. Now that is airflow. So the pressure of gas is what your airflow is determined by, right? So airflow is basically the volume of gas, or the amount of gas moving in and out of your lungs with each breath. And that depends on the pressure gradient. So at sea level, so gas is at 760 millimeters of mercury. That is your atmospheric pressure at sea level. As altitude increases, so increase in altitude makes air thinner. So as you go up in altitude, this 760 millimeters is going to change. It's going to get less. So as the altitude, so imagine you're sitting on a plane and the plane is taking off. So as the altitude increases, air pressure decreases. Per Boyles Law, because the air pressure decreased, air cannot move from an area of low concentration, which is the atmosphere in this case, to an area of high concentration, which is in your lung. So it would become near impossible for you to inhale and exhale if plane cabins were not pressurized. So plane cabins being pressurized means that they're maintaining cabin pressure to simulate normal atmospheric pressure. So if the cabin became depressurized and you were at an increased altitude, say 30,000 feet, it would become near impossible for air to move from the atmosphere into your lung because air pressure in the atmosphere is too low. Now, the next variable we're going to talk about is resistance. Now, resistance typically means an opposing force, right? So think about it. Think about the relationship between airflow and resistance. If resistance increases, airflow decreases. So we've already hashed out the airflow variable. I gave you the airplane example. The same would be true if you were at sea level and you got into a submarine and you went below sea level. If you went into a submarine, gas becomes more pressurized. So there's more pressure in the atmosphere or in the area of lower than sea level, right? And low pressure in your lung. And air moves from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So you would be able to inhale in a submarine, but exhaling would become extremely difficult because gas is so pressurized when you go below sea level. So that air that moves inside and outside on inhalation and exhalation is your total airflow. So if your resistance, say somehow your resistance, if you were to resist that airflow, the airflow would decrease. So resistance and airflow share an inversely proportional relationship as well. So if something were to resist this movement of air going in and out, your total airflow would decrease. So let's talk about this. If F is your total airflow and delta P is the difference between pressure in the atmosphere and pressure inside your lung, right? And R is resistance. So here, essentially, your flow happens inside from lung to atmosphere. So let's say this is the lung, this is the atmosphere. So flow happens from atmosphere to lung when lung pressure, P_alv, is lesser than atmospheric pressure, than PATM. When this is at higher pressure, this is at lower pressure, air is going to flow from atmosphere to lung. The opposite is true as well. So if this is flow, this is lung, and this is atmosphere, when you exhale, the flow is going to happen from lung to atmosphere because your P_alv is going to be greater than P atmosphere. Now, resistance is stuff that comes in the way. And one of the major there's three things that could, or a few things that could change resistance, right? Changing in altitude. So if you increase altitude, the atmospheric pressure decreases, and that's going to affect your flow. If you're getting into a submarine and the cabin of the submarine is not, the pressure air is not managed, that's going to change your flow as well. So one variable to resistance is gas pressure. So pressure changes can cause resistance. 2, so if pressure gradient increases, airflow to lungs changes. How does airflow to lungs change, right? That depends on whether the pressure gradient, in which way the pressure gradient is changing. So if you decrease the pressure gradient, decrease the airflow. increase the pressure gradient, you increase the airflow. But pressure gradient changing can cause resistance. So if resistance increases, your airflow decreases. So one form of resistance could be a plane cabin that suddenly becomes depressurized. So things that can cause resistance, right, or things that can cause difficulty moving air. One is if the muscles of your chest, like your intercostals, your diaphragm, your scalene, sternocleidomastoid, your pecs, they lose elasticity. So for whatever reason, you are unable to change volume of thoracic cavity. That is one variable that could cause resistance. So if you can't expand your thoracic cavity, that's causing resistance. If you can't contract your thoracic cavity, that's causing resistance to airflow as well. Second variable is change in the bronchiole or bronchi diameter. So we talked about this briefly when I showed you the cross-section of a airway in one of the previous lecture videos. So here is a lumen of your bronchiole, right? So something happens, you have a bunch of mucus that hardens, you have, you're reacting to some allergen in the atmosphere. So this becomes hardened, and the diameter of your bronchiole decreases significantly. So if that diameter of your bronchiole decreases, it increases resistance, because suddenly you don't have, the airflow is sort of restricted, right? So bronchoconstriction increases resistance. Bronchodilation decreases resistance. The third variable is the overall health or the hollowness of your alveoli. So alveoli are sacs like this, and they're hollow on the inside. We have our type 1 alveolar cell, which is your simple squamous. We have the type 2 alveolar cell, which is the macrophage, right? For some reason, and remember your alveolar type 2 cell, which is the cuboidal cell. Sorry if I said macrophage earlier. So this is type 1, your simple squamous cell. Type 2, which is your cuboidal cell. Your cuboidal cell is going to secrete a very watery fluid called surfactant. So that surfactant is basically lining all your alveolar sacs. It's keeping your alveoli nice and moist. So if your alveoli were to collapse and look sort of like this, they lose volume. That can increase resistance as well, because you don't have room for the air to come in. So less air coming in equals less oxygen going to your tissues. So to recap, airflow is the total amount of air going from the atmosphere to your lung and from your lung to the atmosphere. The pressure gradient is basically the difference in pressure from atmosphere and the inside of your lung at any given point. And air moves from a high pressure area to a low pressure area. So to inhale, the atmospheric pressure has to be higher than intra-lung pressure. To exhale, your intra-lung pressure has to be higher than the atmospheric pressure. Now, the opposing force to this airflow is resistance, right? Now, that can happen if you lose chest elasticity. So your muscles aren't working, they're spasmed, they're cramped, your diaphragm, like you lost the nerve that innervates the diaphragm, the phrenic nerve, and as a result, your diaphragm isn't contracting and relaxing anymore. That can cause resistance because you're not able to change lung and thoracic volume. Your bronchi could constrict from being inflamed. They could constrict because you have an overproduction of mucus. That mucus could harden. You could have like plaques in your airway. Blockage in airway can cause resistance. And the loss of alveolar volume. So your alveoli collapsing can cause resistance as well. So let's add another variable here. The opposite of resistance would be compliance. So when your muscles are working okay and you are able to inhale and exhale just fine, your lung is expanding to accommodate air, your lung is contracting and squeezing out all the carbon dioxide, airflow is happening normally, right? So when there's normal airflow, so when airflow is normal, your lung is complying. So good compliance, good lung compliance is nice and increased airflow. If any of those variables from the previous slide happen, so you lose alveolar volume, your alveoli collapse, you are unable to expand and contract your chest because the altitude changed or your muscles aren't working anymore, that is when resistance creeps in. So increased resistance equals decreased compliance. Decreased resistance equals increased compliance. So we've gone over one of the three gas laws, which is Boyles Law, and we've talked about the concept of airflow, pressure gradient, resistance, and compliance. So for example, one of the examples of resistance is collapsed alveoli. So remember, your alveoli are type 2 cells are producing surfactant. And surfactant is a liquid, and it is causing surface tension, right? So oxygen can dissolve basically into that surfactant and go into your bloodstream. Now, premature infants, lungs are one of the last organs to develop in utero because a fetus in utero is getting all oxygen from the mother's bloodstream through your umbilical artery and umbilical vein, right? So the air is actually not entering the lung itself until the fetus is born. So in premature infants, the alveolar type 2 cells aren't fully developed yet, so they're not producing surfactant. Because they're not producing surfactant, oxygen is not able to dissolve in from their alveoli, and as a result, the alveoli collapse. The alveoli collapsing is causing resistance. Because there's increased resistance, there's decreased compliance. And decreased compliance equals decreased air flow. So as a result, the infant, the premature infant, is having trouble breathing air from the atmosphere. That is respiratory distress syndrome. And we're going to talk about how that is mitigated when we meet in lab. So essentially, the greater the compliance, meaning the lung is able to easily expand and contract, and air is able to enter and exit your lungs with ease. Now, the last slide here is how respiratory function is measured. And it's measured in a medical setting using a machine or a device called a spirometer, right? So I'm going to leave it to you to self-study this and expect a match the following on one of your exams that talks about all of these concepts. So what is tidal volume, what is IRV, what is ERV, and residual volume. And all the definitions are clearly put in here. So all you have to do is read and make notes of this. So I'm going to stop this here. And in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about the other two laws and the rest of the gas exchange.